have to be out of here by 5 o'clock. There's another meeting. And recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Paul, for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome the panel. And it's especially nice to see Dr. Meltzer here. I would like to start with a question to Dr. Meltzer because I wanted to follow up on his testimony about the Latin American crisis, where he mentioned that the Federal Reserve went to the IMF and instructed the IMF to pay interest to those banks that were exposed. And, of course, that was without congressional permission. And I think it makes a point, one of the points that I've been trying to make, and that is transparency of the Federal Reserve. It sounded to me like the majority here is for independence, which is a code word for secrecy, and in opposition to transparency. And it's always used for the public interest. Of course, I think the public interest is served by exposure and knowing what's going on and whose interests are being served, and that's why I would like to see a lot more transparency. But the question I have for Dr. Meltzer is, since he's aware of this, he's published this, is this a good reason for us to know a lot more about the agreements that the Federal Reserve makes? Because they can make agreements with international banking institutions, and we have no right. We may have a right under the Constitution that we should, but we don't. We've given up that right. We've given up that privilege. Would this be a good example of why we need to know more of what exactly the Federal Reserve is doing?
Yes. Let me begin by saying independence, to me, and I believe to many of the members of the panel, does not mean lack of transparency. It means protection. The reason we have independent central banks is so that they don't expand under pressure from Congress, from the administration, from the banking community, and from others. We want them to be independent, to make their judgments because they are obligated by law to maintain high employment and low inflation. Now, that law doesn't work very well, at least in my opinion, but that's why we want independence. So, transparency, how can you be against transparency? But I believe the Congress would be more effective in its oversight of the Federal Reserve if it concentrated much more on outcomes and much less on process. Let them make their decisions the way they want to make them. Monitor the process. They are not living up to the mandate to maintain full employment or high employment and low inflation, and that's what we should be concerned about.
I thank you, and I'm going to hurry along because our 5 minutes runs out rather quickly. But I wanted to ask Dr. Galbraith a question because he's worked here and he knows the system, so I've been rather shocked at what you presented here. You actually talked about the Constitution. Didn't you find out that we're not supposed to do that around here? We don't have that much concern about it. So I was delighted, from my viewpoint, that you brought this up and reminded us about Henry Royce's concern about the constitutionality of the FOMC. And, of course, I agree with that. But I wanted to see if there's a little bit more that you might agree with, because there are some who believe that we shouldn't be doing anything unless it's explicitly authorized. And, of course, the central bank is not authorized. It's been ordained by the courts and the Congress, but it was never explicitly authorized. But the more practical point that I might be able to get you a comment on is the concept of the budget. I mean, the Fed is a government unto itself. You know, they hire and make their wages, and it doesn't go through the ordinary process. The Constitution says it should all go through the constitutional process. And also, maybe you could comment on these foreign agreements. These are like treaties. The Federal Reserve goes and makes these agreements, and they pass out money. Does this strike you as maybe that, too, might be challenged if you happen to come at this from a constitutional viewpoint?
Well, I think under the Constitution, the Congress has every right for whatever information it seeks from the Federal Reserve. And if the Congress were to decide to change the way the Federal Reserve is funded, it would also have the right to do that. It seems to me it would be an appropriate decision for Congress to make.
So they would then have a right, but But my proposal that we find out more, you would say that would be right and proper to find out what type of agreements they've made with other governments, other central banks, international banking organizations?
My own view on this is that as a member of Congress, you're entitled to that information. That would be the position I would have understood to be the case when I was working here 30 years ago.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired.